November 30th, 1950, MiG Alley, North Korea. The contrail appears first, a thin white line scratched across the frozen blue sky above the Yalu River. Soviet pilot Captain Nikolai Sutiagin, flying under North Korean markings to maintain the fiction of Soviet non-involvement, banks his MiG-15 hard left, scanning for the American fighter he knows is nearby. Then he sees it, an F-86 Sabre, silver skin gleaming in the morning sun, turning impossibly tight at 30,000 feet, bleeding speed but maintaining control in ways his instructors said were aerodynamically impossible. Sutiagin pushes his throttle forward, the Klimov VK-1 engine roaring as he tries to close the distance. The Sabre rolls inverted and pulls through, and suddenly Sutiagin is staring at empty sky. The American has vanished not through superior speed, the MiG is actually faster in level flight, but through maneuverability that defies Soviet understanding of high-altitude combat. Sutiagin's wingman calls out a warning too late. The Sabre has reversed position entirely, is now on Sutiagin's tail, and the Soviet pilot feels his aircraft shudder as tracers streak past his canopy. He brakes hard, pulling until his vision grays at the edges, until the G-forces press him into his seat with crushing weight. The Sabre follows effortlessly, staying glued to his tail through maneuvers that should have caused it to stall and fall from the sky. Sutiagin realizes with cold clarity that he is fighting an aircraft that operates according to different rules, that possesses some quality his MiG lacks, some invisible advantage that renders Soviet tactical doctrine obsolete. He dives desperately toward the sanctuary of Chinese airspace, his engine screaming, his heart pounding, understanding that he has just encountered technology he cannot see, cannot understand, and cannot defeat. To comprehend the shock that rippled through Soviet aviation circles as the air war over Korea unfolded, one must first understand what Soviet military intelligence had promised about the new American jet fighter. The F-86 Sabre, they said, was essentially a swept-wing development of conventional American design philosophy, adequate but unexceptional, built for reliability rather than performance, flown by pilots trained in safe conservative tactics that prioritized survival over victory. The MiG-15, by contrast, represented the cutting edge of Soviet aeronautical engineering, a nimble interceptor with superior thrust-to-weight ratio, better rate of climb, higher service ceiling, and heavier armament than anything the Americans possessed. On paper, the MiG-15 was the superior fighter. Soviet pilots were told they would dominate the skies over Korea. That American numerical advantage would be meaningless against Soviet technical superiority, that the war would demonstrate to the world that Soviet aviation had surpassed its capitalist rivals. The first aerial encounters suggested otherwise. The F-86 Sabre had entered service in 1949, just as the MiG-15 was beginning deployment with Soviet air forces. Both aircraft represented the first generation of swept-wing jet fighters. Both had been influenced by captured German research from the Second World War, and both had similar performance envelopes. But the Sabre possessed an advantage that Soviet intelligence had not detected during pre-war assessments, a technology so subtle that it left no visible signature, no telltale modification that photographic reconnaissance could identify. The secret was hydraulic flight controls, specifically an irreversible hydraulic control system that allowed pilots to make precise control inputs at high speed without fighting the tremendous aerodynamic forces that built up on control surfaces during high-speed maneuvers. Soviet MiG-15 pilots controlled their aircraft through a conventional mechanical linkage system, Control stick movements were transmitted through cables and rods directly to the control surfaces. This worked adequately at moderate speeds, but as velocity increased, the forces required to move the controls became immense. Pilots had to muscle the stick, using both hands sometimes, fighting against air pressure that resisted every input. At high altitude, where air was thin, the controls became mushy and unresponsive. At high speed, near sea level, the controls became stiff and sluggish. The F-86's hydraulic system eliminated this problem entirely. When the pilot moved the stick, he was not directly moving the control surfaces, but rather commanding hydraulic actuators to move them. The physical force required was minimal, allowing precise control inputs regardless of speed or altitude. This seemingly simple advantage translated into overwhelming tactical superiority in combat. American pilots could maneuver aggressively at speeds and altitudes where Soviet pilots struggled to maintain control. They could reverse direction more quickly, could sustain tighter turns without exhausting themselves, could make the small adjustments necessary for accurate gunnery without the control stick fighting back. The technology was invisible from outside the aircraft, impossible to detect through visual observation, and its effects were so dramatic that Soviet pilots initially attributed American maneuverability to superior pilot skill rather than superior engineering. Captain Yevgeny Pepelyayev, one of the most successful Soviet fighter pilots in Korea with 19 confirmed kills, would describe his first encounter with the Sabre's mysterious advantage in debriefing sessions preserved in Soviet military archives. The American aircraft moved like it was alive, responding instantly to the pilot's intentions. Our MiGs required physical strength to control at high speed. We had to anticipate, to use both hands, to fight the aircraft as much as we fought the enemy. The Americans made corrections that should have been impossible. They could track targets during hard turns. They could make firing passes that required control precision we could not match. We assumed at first they were better pilots, more experienced, but experienced pilots in MiGs still could not match inexperienced Americans in Sabres. The aircraft itself was different in some fundamental way we could not identify. Soviet intelligence services expended enormous effort trying to discover what made the F-86 so capable. They interviewed captured American pilots, examined gun camera footage frame by frame looking for clues, analyzed wreckage from downed Sabres, and eventually obtained remarkably accurate intelligence about the hydraulic flight control system through espionage networks. But knowing about the technology and replicating it proved to be entirely different challenges. Soviet hydraulic engineering in the early 1950s could not produce actuators with the precision and reliability required for flight control applications. Their fluid seals leaked under the temperature extremes and vibration of combat flight. Their hydraulic pumps failed after relatively few operating hours. Most critically, their control system designers lacked experience with the feedback loops and fail-safe mechanisms necessary to make hydraulic controls safe and predictable. American aerospace companies had been developing hydraulic systems for years, refining designs through thousands of test flights, building institutional knowledge about what worked and what failed. Soviet engineers were starting from theoretical understanding, without the benefit of accumulated practical experience. The kill ratio told a story that Soviet propaganda could not obscure. By the war's end in 1953, F-86 Sabres had shot down approximately 792 MiG-15s, while losing only 78 Sabres to MiG fire, a kill ratio of better than 10-1 in favor of the Americans. Soviet records, released after the Cold War's end, confirmed that these figures were broadly accurate. though they showed higher Soviet losses than American intelligence had estimated. The disparity was not due to pilot quality. Many Soviet pilots in Korea were combat veterans with experience from the Great Patriotic War. It was not due to numerical superiority. UN forces often operated at numerical disadvantage in MiG Alley. It was due to the invisible advantage of hydraulic controls, combined with other American innovations like the radar-ranging gun sight that automatically computed lead angles for gunnery, making accurate shooting dramatically easier than the manual deflection shooting Soviet pilots practiced. The radar-ranging gun sight, that designated NPG-30, represented another technology gap that Soviet intelligence had underestimated. The system used a small radar to measure range to the target, combined this with the target's angular rate of change as observed through the gun sight, and automatically computed the correct lead angle for the guns. The pilot simply placed the illuminated pipper on the target and fired. The system accounted for bullet drop, time of flight, and relative motion automatically. Soviet MiG pilots used conventional optical gun sights and had to estimate lead angles through experience and judgment, a skill that required extensive training and even then was more art than science. The American system turned gunnery into a matter of placing the gun sight on the target and pressing the trigger. Gun camera footage from F-86 shows accurate fire from firing positions and angles that Soviet pilots would not have attempted, knowing that manual deflection shooting would be nearly impossible under those conditions. The psychological impact on Soviet pilots accumulated through repeated encounters where their aircraft, supposedly superior, proved unable to match American capabilities in actual combat. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Smorchkov, commanding a squadron of MiG-15s during 1952, reported in classified debriefings that morale problems developed as pilots realized they were flying inferior aircraft, despite official claims of Soviet superiority. The propaganda told us American technology was crude, quantity over quality, that our advanced socialist science had produced the world's best fighter. Then we flew against the Sabres and learned otherwise. The Americans could outturn us, could track us during maneuvers, could shoot accurately from positions we could not. Pilots began requesting transfers. Some developed medical excuses to avoid combat missions. We were not cowards. Many had faced German fighters over Moscow and Stalingrad. But we were being asked to fight with one hand tied behind our backs, denied the technology that would make victory possible, while our commanders insisted the problem was pilot technique or lack of fighting spirit. The symbolic power of the control stick became a recurring element in Soviet pilot accounts of air combat over Korea. In pre-flight briefings and debriefings, pilots would flex their hands, demonstrating the physical strain of controlling the MiG-15 during high-speed combat. They developed calluses from gripping the stick during violent maneuvers. They experienced arm fatigue that limited how long they could sustain aggressive maneuvering. The control stick, that most basic interface between pilot and aircraft, had become a limitation, a physical reminder that Soviet engineering had failed to match American capability in a fundamental way. American pilots, by contrast, flew with relaxed hands, using fingertip pressure to make control inputs, conserving their energy for tactical decisions rather than exhausting themselves fighting their own aircraft. The difference was subtle but profound, and it manifested in every aspect of air combat performance. Soviet attempts to develop hydraulic flight control systems accelerated after the Korean War demonstrated their importance, but implementation proved slow and difficult. The MiG-17, which entered service in 1952, still used mechanical controls. The MiG-19, which flew in 1953, incorporated hydraulic power boosting, but retained mechanical backup systems because Soviet designers did not trust the hydraulics' reliability. Not until the MiG-21 in 1959 did Soviet fighters fully embrace hydraulic controls with the level of integration that F-86 had demonstrated a decade earlier. The lag was not due to lack of understanding, but to the accumulated industrial and institutional knowledge required to make hydraulic controls work reliably under combat conditions. American aerospace companies had built this knowledge through years of development and testing. Soviet industry had to learn through failure and iteration, a process that could not be rushed, no matter how many resources were allocated. The economic implications troubled Soviet leadership. Documents from Central Committee meetings in the mid-1950s show growing concern that the Korean War had revealed systematic weaknesses in Soviet military-industrial development. The MiG-15 had been designed and produced quickly, prioritizing rapid deployment over refinement. American development cycles were longer, but the resulting aircraft incorporated mature technologies rather than pushing immature systems into service. The F-86 represented not a breakthrough, but the careful application of technologies that American industry had been developing for years. Soviet industry could match American innovation given time and resources, but it consistently lagged in turning innovations into reliable operational systems. The hydraulic control system exemplified this pattern. Soviet engineers understood the principles, could build prototypes, but struggled to produce systems that worked consistently under the demanding conditions of combat operations. The training implications were equally significant. American pilots trained extensively on hydraulic-equipped aircraft before entering combat, developing the fine motor control and tactical awareness that hydraulic controls enabled. Soviet pilots trained on aircraft with mechanical controls, learning techniques that emphasized physical strength and anticipation. When they transitioned to combat, they found that their training had prepared them for a different kind of air combat than what they actually encountered. American pilots could exploit their aircraft's full performance envelope from their first combat mission. Soviet pilots had to unlearn habits and develop new techniques while simultaneously facing life-or-death combat. A disadvantage that contributed directly to the lopsided loss ratios. The transformation in Soviet aviation doctrine following Korea was profound and lasting. The assumption that superior performance specifications guaranteed air superiority was abandoned. New emphasis was placed on controllability and handling qualities alongside raw performance. Development processes were extended to allow more thorough testing. Most importantly, Soviet military leadership accepted that American technological capability was more advanced than propaganda admitted, that closing the gap would require acknowledging Western superiority in certain areas rather than insisting on Soviet supremacy across all domains. This represented a significant ideological shift, one that Khrushchev's regime embraced more readily than Stalin's had, but one that created tension within military circles where admission of American advantages was seen as defeatist. The F-86 Sabre ended its operational career with American forces in the late 1950s, replaced by more advanced fighters, but it continued serving with Allied air forces into the 1990s. Its combat record stood as testimony to what properly integrated technology could achieve. Soviet pilots who faced Sabres over Korea carried the memory of those encounters throughout their careers, often rising to senior positions where they influenced Soviet aviation development. Their insistence on addressing fundamental quality issues rather than pursuing paper performance specifications helped create the generation of Soviet fighters that finally achieved parity with American designs in the 1970s. The lesson had been expensive, hundreds of pilots lost, thousands of aircraft destroyed, but it had been learned, and so we returned to that moment over the Yalu River, to Captain Sutiagin fighting his control stick, watching the Sabre follow him through maneuvers that should have been impossible, understanding that he is defeated not by visible technology, but by invisible advantages that render his training obsolete. The control stick he grips with both hands, pulling until his muscles scream, is not just a flight control, but a symbol of technological disadvantage, of industrial limitation, of the gap between propaganda promises and combat reality. American pilots flying Sabres that respond to fingertip pressure are not inherently better warriors, but are equipped with systems that amplify their capabilities, that free them to focus on tactics while Soviet pilots exhaust themselves fighting their own aircraft. The hydraulic control system, invisible, undetectable, seemingly simple, proves more decisive than speed or altitude or firepower because it enables everything else. It allows the precision that makes radar-ranging gun sights effective. It allows the sustained maneuvering that wins turning fights. It allows pilots to maintain focus through long missions rather than arriving at combat already fatigued from fighting their controls during transit. The secret technology the Soviet pilots never saw coming was not revolutionary but evolutionary, not a breakthrough, but the careful refinement of existing concepts, not a single innovation but the systematic application of mature technologies that together created overwhelming advantage. It demonstrated that technological competition between nations is not won through spectacular advances, but through the accumulated superiority of thousands of small improvements, through industrial capacity that can translate engineering knowledge into reliable operational systems, through institutional experience that knows which innovations will prove valuable and which will prove troublesome. The F-86 Sabre was possible only in an aerospace industry that had decades of experience refining hydraulic systems, in an economy that could afford the extensive testing required to ensure reliability, in a society that valued engineering excellence and supported the patient development cycles necessary to achieve it. Soviet industry could observe these advantages, could understand them, could even replicate individual elements, but could not match the comprehensive system that produced them. The control stick that Soviet pilots fought against was not merely a design choice, but a reflection of different industrial philosophies, different development priorities, different relationships between engineering and manufacturing, and in the sky over Korea, those differences translated directly into survival or death, victory or defeat, superiority or submission to an enemy whose advantages remained invisible until the moment they proved decisive.